mentioned, I only just moved to Göttingen, and I think giving this presentation is a great way to start the professorship of science communication. Probably most of you, or maybe all of you, were quite disturbed when you heard the European Court of Justice's ruling that genome editing must be regulated as traditional transgenic breeding techniques. And this judgment, or the European law as it is based upon, mirrors the widely held skepticism of green biotechnology in European countries. And while in European countries, and Spain and Portugal are the only exception here, while in European countries support of green biotechnologies was never particularly high, support even decreased in the 2000er years. For example, in the 1990s, about 2/3 of the Spanish population supported GM foods. But in 2010, only 1/3 did so. Another example, Germany, in the 1990s, about 45% of the German population supported GM foods. In 2010, that share had declined to about 20%. And in many other European countries, support of GM foods, in particular, and in green biotechnologies, declined sharply in the 2000er years. And this skepticism applies to GM foods. In 2010, all in all, Europeans did not consider GM foods as safe, nor as beneficial, but did consider it as inequitable and unnatural. And the skepticism also applies to animal cloning, for example. Again, in 2010, all in all, Europeans did not consider animal cloning as safe, nor as beneficial, but did consider it as unnatural and inequitable. And probably these views, these assessments, run counter to many of your assessments or your judgments. And I would like to ask the question, why is this so? How can we explain this gap between scientific knowledge and public views? There are surely many reasons. I'm going to focus on some of them. I can't really pay attention to all of the possible reasons one could name here, but hopefully I will stir some discussion, and we can discuss other reasons later on. Let me start by looking at the stakeholders of biotechnological research. When science and technology are discussed in public, they are not assessed according to purely scientific criteria. I think you all know this by observation. When science and technology are discussed in public, they are also discussed with regard to ethical criteria, political, economical criteria, and so on. And accordingly, in such discussions typically involve actors from various social or societal domains. From civil society, from the sciences, from businesses, from politics, the churches, and so on. And all these actors from these different societal domains have different interests in society. And these interests shape their views on scientific knowledge and the ways they account for scientific knowledge in public. Let me give you an example study. We conducted representative surveys of stakeholders of biotechnological research in Germany. We asked scientists, representatives of companies, of NGOs and government agencies, how likely they would stress uncertainties of biotechnological research in public, how likely they would emphasize knowledge gaps, for example, or other uncertainties of scientific research. And we also asked them what could happen if they point out such scientific uncertainties in public. Precisely, we asked them how likely certain consequences would occur after mentioning or pointing out uncertainties, and how they rate these consequences, whether they think those consequences are desirable or undesirable. And then for each of the consequences, I will show you see the consequences here. For each of these consequences, we multiplied their assessments to obtain what we called expectancy value terms. But let me put it in everyday language. High values indicate that stakeholders hope that a certain consequence will result from stressing uncertainties in public. And low values indicate that stakeholders rather fear that certain consequences will arise. They think that a consequence is highly likely and undesirable. Now, we conducted regression analyses, and with these analyses we can show or depict the different rationales actors have when they point out uncertainties in public. Scientists are the more prone to point out uncertainties, the more they believe that this will attract funding, and the more they think that it is right to do so, the more they personally believe it is the right thing to be transparent about uncertainties. Representatives of companies, like scientists, they are the more prone to point out uncertainties, the more they think that this will attract funding or investments, and they are also guided by their organizational demands. If they feel supported by their organization, they will point out uncertainty. Representatives of public interest groups have quite a different rationale. They are the more prone to point out uncertainties, the more they believe that doing so they can increase public criticism of biotechnological research, and also the more this is in line with their personal conviction. The representative of government agencies are very hard to read. The negative values you see here indicate that they have what might first seem as some irrational intentions. These values mean that they are the more likely to point out uncertainties, the more they fear that this will increase public criticism, and the more they fear that this will put journalists off the topic. And they are the more, this is also irrational, they are the more likely to point out uncertainties, the more they think it is wrong to do so, the more this goes against their personal conviction. However, and this is rational, they are the more likely to point out uncertainties, the more they think that this is what their organization demands. I think we could talk at length about the results for the government agencies here. One reason for the seeming irrationality might be, or it might be a reflection of the position of the government agencies in a conflict where they maybe cannot act according to their own convictions, but have to somehow do what their organization requires them to do. But I don't want to go into detail here. Maybe we can discuss this slide later. The point that I want to make here is that different societal actors have very different rationales for communicating scientific evidence in public. And their rationales are guided by their interests. And now the question is, who has a voice in public, who makes their case heard in public. Now, traditionally, scientists from academia and from industry did not participate very actively in the public discussion of the politics of green biotechnological research. And there are surely many reasons. One reason is that at first, in the 90s, they didn't have to. They didn't have to participate in the public debate because they had direct access to many policymakers. For example, because scientists were frequently called upon as experts to hearings or to other on other opportunities. By contrast, NGOs they couldn't approach political decision makers directly to raise their concerns, their ethical concerns, their environmental concerns, their social concerns, and instead they had to draw public attention. NGOs had to draw public attention to put pressure onto policymakers and through that find resonance in politics. And this is one of the reasons why scientists and also businesses didn't play so much of a role in the public debate. We see here an example. These are results of a media content analysis of media coverage of the regulations of genetic engineering in 2003 and 2004. As you recall from the slide I showed before, this was a very crucial debate when many Europeans and Germans too formed their attitudes about green biotechnologies. And it was also a time when European countries, and Germany as well, debated on how to put EU directives into national legislation. And we can see that in this crucial debate, science actors from science hardly got a voice, or they hardly raised a voice. We don't know if it was scientists or journalists' fault, so to say. And also, business hardly played a role in the public media discourse. Instead, the debate was largely shaped by interest groups, apart from actors from state and politics. And among these interest groups, the biggest groups were from environmental and consumer protection, and also from, especially from organic agricultural businesses. So NGOs were successful in becoming visible in the media, but not only that, NGOs were also very successful in creating very effective messages. For example, containing emotional appeals or containing symbols that implicitly associated genetic engineering or green biotechnologies, GM foods, with other technologies that had drawn a very high degree of public criticism already, as we can see in these stickers that Germans probably are all familiar with. So these are some of the reasons why NGOs dominated the debate, and the 2000s were a period when many Europeans and many Germans formed their attitudes towards green biotechnologies. They formed their attitudes in the debates over regulations, when food markets decided not to sell GM foods anymore, and when NGOs campaigned against green biotechnologies and GM foods. So I would like to mention some of the consequences of this. And these consequences are also consequences that put a major challenge on science communication today, and they further explain why it is so difficult to close the gap between scientific knowledge and public attitudes or public assumptions. One would think, and actually practitioners of science communication used to or do still think so, that in this situation, to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and public attitudes, it would be a good idea to deliver facts, that factual information could redeem this situation. However, the problem is that facts alone cannot immediately help in this situation. And I'm sure that from observing the debate, many of you have encountered instances of this already, and facts can even, factual information can even backfire. This is the situation we are in today. This is the situation you have when people hold very firm attitudes, when they are very convinced, when they have very firm beliefs. And this is what is the case when we speak about GM foods, green biotechnologies, and so on. When people hold very strong convictions, they use factual information to protect their belief systems, to protect their own attitudes, even if they are confronted with information that contradicts their views. I will illustrate this with a study researchers conducted among US citizens. The US researchers measured US citizens' attitudes towards GM foods. And a few days after this measurement, they confronted the participants with scientific facts on GM foods. And here's the facts, and one of those facts was against GM foods, and the other one was supportive of GM foods. The fact against is the one we see up here. It says, there have not been studies on the long-term health effects of GM foods on humans, but a recent study on animals found that genetically modified potatoes damaged the digestive tracts of rats. That's a piece of factual information that you would say is rather against GM foods. The argument or the factual information supportive of GM foods is a recent study on GM foods found that a type of rice, namely golden rice, can be produced with a high content of vitamin A, which is used to prevent blindness. And now what we see here is that those participants who had a very low support, well, who rather rejected GM foods, they thought that the argument against GM foods is rather effective. They said the argument against GM food is a good argument and it's a very powerful argument. In comparison, the argument for GM foods is not such an effective argument. It's not such a convincing, such a powerful argument. And then at the other end of the scale, we see that these judgments are reversed. People who are very supportive or who were very supportive of GM foods in the beginning, they thought that the argument supporting GM foods, this one is rather effective, and that the argument against GM foods is less effective. And this is just one example of what we call motivated reasoning. There's ample of other evidence on motivated reasoning in the literature on the science of science communication. This is just one example. Motivated reasoning is a kind of reasoning individuals employ, and we all do that too in other contexts, it's a kind of reasoning that protects my attitudes, my belief system. And once the public has developed strong attitudes, it's very hard to reach them with facts because they are kind of immune to facts. So this is you can see why this is a challenge for science communication, and the challenge is even bigger because we found that motivated reasoning does not only prevail among lay people, but also, for example, among journalists. I don't have an example now on GM foods, but on another technology, nuclear power. Cornelia Motes, a researcher from the Technical University of Dresden, conducted an experiment with journalists. And she confronted journalists with factual information on nuclear power. And some of that information was supportive, and some of that information was, rather questioned the use of nuclear power. And actually, she conducted this experiment a few months before the Fukushima incidents. That is probably important to say. And the participants were German journalists. Now, what did she find? First, she was interested in the question of which pieces of information do the journalists consider newsworthy, as we say in communication science? Which information do they consider informational and, well, fit to print, so to say? And the good news is the journalists considered information as informational or as newsworthy when they considered the information objective. So from this we can deduce, well, many journalists want to be objective, and if they consider information objective, they think it's fit to print and they will report on it in their news coverage. However, the question is, what kind of information do journalists consider objective? And here we see their subjective influences. The journalists in this case considered that information as objective that supported their views, that was in line with their own attitudes. So the opponents of nuclear energy thought that information was objective, that was against nuclear energy, and the supporters of nuclear power considered that information objective that supported nuclear power. So this is an example of the strength of motivated reasoning, and it shows us that even journalists, once they have developed strong attitudes, it's even hard to reach journalists with scientific information. So let me sum up. Why do we have such a gap between public attitudes and scientific knowledge? We saw that public attitudes toward green biotechnologies largely formed in the 1990s and the 2000er years, and people developed very strong attitudes. That was a time when scientific arguments played a minor role, even when scientists were visible in news coverage. We can say that NGO campaigns against GM foods, for example, was much more powerful, and the result of this is a gap between scientific knowledge and public attitudes. And now we have a situation that people's attitudes towards green biotechnologies are so firm that it is hard to reach them with scientific arguments right away, I have to say. Because what do we have to do in this situation? I don't want to encourage scientists to engage in the public debate. This may seem somewhat sarcastic now after all I showed you, because as a scientist, of course, when you speak up for GM foods, for example, well, you can expect that you are confronted with some motivated reasoning and maybe with some people who would discredit you. Discrediting some information is a way, a strategy people employ in the process of motivated reasoning. I would still encourage you to provide factual information and also to develop infrastructures where you can protect, or where scientists can be kind of protected when they encounter public hostility. Maybe some of you experienced speaking up in public and encountering public hostility, and we all know this can be really distressing. So I think there's a great responsibility on the side of the organizations and also the scientific communities to show solidarity with scientists who speak up in public and try to provide the public debate with more factual information, because this is the only way we can eventually bridge the gap between what is known in science and what is debated in public. It is important when you do that you are transparent and that you are approachable. So it might be a good idea to invite journalists, to talk to journalists, to show them your labs, to talk to them. It might be important, or it is surely important, not to politicize. What do I mean by that? When I look on social media, for example, I see many instances of the politicization of the dispute, where people start to use polarizing communication styles. For example, actors who are in favor of GM foods and also actors who are against GM foods, they start to ridicule people with different views. They start to become sarcastic, offensive, and all this is a no-go. Because if you do that, if people do that even on social media, that doesn't help in this controversy, and that doesn't help to make science appear more serious and trustworthy. And also important, I think I said that already, but do not look down on lay people's views, because all we saw here, we can't really blame lay people for the views they developed, because they had good reasons to develop the views they hold. And then, of course, there's a big task for the science of science communication. All I told you here looks very hopeless, I would say, and there's a reason for this. Maybe 2 or 1 decade ago, we assumed that we could redeem public debates, or the lack of a scientific basis in public debates, by providing facts. And we thought that if we just give people factual information, they would just accept it. And then we tried to make some research on this, and we realized it's not that easy. The answer is not that simple. It doesn't work this way. And now we have an open question. The question is, how does it work? And I gave you an answer. It's a pessimistic answer, but one great open question is, what do we have to do? How can we do this? I tried to give you some pieces of advice that I deducted from research, but there are still many open questions for research. For example, how can we maintain credibility as science? What is effective science communication? And these are some of the questions that I will do in my time here in Göttingen. Thank you for your attention.